The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Building a Culture of Accountability. We're excited to have you all on the line. Just before we start, I want to bring your attention to the chat dialog box in your right-hand side of the screen. If you have questions, please type them in to that chat box, and we will have some time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And if they come up during, feel free to send them in, and if I can address them right away, I will. Otherwise, we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Before we get started, I just want to bring your attention to that conference that's coming up in New York on the 28th and 29th of September, Building Resiliency in Family and Business. We have a great program. We have Michael Greenspun, one of the family members from the New York Times, who's going to be talking about how the New York Times is dealing with the challenges of the competitive environment and staying resilient, and how they have created a sense of connection and unity about staying together as a family and a business across time. We also have Terry Peugeot, who's coming over from France from the Peugeot Motor Group, talking about some of the challenges that their family has faced, and of course Richard Edelman from Edelman Public Relations talking about their family trust survey and the trust that people put in family businesses. So we also have a family-hosted visit on enhancing board performance that'll be hosted by the Follett family October 19th and 20th here in Chicago. If you want to register for either of these events, please contact Jennifer Muntz at jmuntz@fbn-na.org. And just a quick note, Jennifer was originally going to be on this webinar, but due to the hurricane in Florida and wireless connectivity challenges, Jennifer is not available to join us for this webinar. So I'm Andrew Kite. I'm the president of FBN North America. Jennifer is the executive director. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, either of us, for questions, so on and so forth. Hoping you can join us for both of those events. And before we get into the webinar itself, I just want to reinforce our values as a network. This fits into the theme of accountability, as we as an organization always want to be held accountable to our values of trust and openness, building a sense of open communication and trust, encouraging participations by family members, reaching out family to family. That's what makes this network valuable. Of course, confidentiality is critical, so whatever we talk about in an FBN event, whether it be a webinar, a family-hosted visit, or one of our family forums, that information is confidential. Non-solicitation, and of course, respect and professionalism. So please note that and know that any questions you ask will not be called out to you specifically on this webinar. So today's objectives. We want to increase the understanding of the role and power of accountability in family business. And we're going to talk about family business governance as one of the drivers of accountability. We have interpersonal accountability from an individual to an individual, but in a family business governance sense, our family has the family council, the family meetings, boards of directors as drivers of accountability, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to examine accountability as an output of specific actions. We're going to go through a very specific model of accountability, and we'll ask you to reflect a little bit on the role of accountability in your own family. We'll start by just reinforcing something that we know, that families that survive ownership, unity, and family cohesion are one of their greatest strategic advantages. The research shows that families that have survived for over 200 years have a sense of unity and cohesion that's broader than just about making money. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the webinar, but we want to emphasize that when we don't have accountability in a family business, that often this sense of family unity and cohesion erodes. And what we mean by accountability is an obligation or willingness to accept responsibility or account for one's actions. And so this is building a sense within the culture of the family, within the culture of the organization, that we are willing to and want to be held accountable to each other. So here's a little example of how it typically shows up in a family business. Is we do a lot of finger pointing. And when we don't step up to our responsibilities, when we aren't accountable to each other, it starts to erode that sense of unity in the context of a family and or a business, and starts to eat at the culture. So a few framing thoughts for you to think about. If we want unity, we must all be unifiers. If we want accountability, each of us must be accountable for all we do. So we can't fall into the mode of do as I say, not as I do, because that will ultimately erode trust across time, where we expect others to be accountable and we aren't willing to be held accountable. And accountability again is very tied to that sense of unity and connection and willingness to work together. When we fail to set boundaries and hold people accountable, we feel used and mistreated. This is why we sometimes attack who they are, which is far more hurtful than addressing a behavior or a choice. So when we give feedback, when we talk about instances where somebody hasn't been accountable, we tend to lean towards attacking who they are, which is far more hurtful than just talking about a behavior and how it impacts us. So we'll go a little bit deeper into that as well. And finally, accountability breeds responsibility. So we'll go through a model of accountability to help you think about how accountability shows up in your organizations. So with that, I want to do two quick polls to see where we are in terms of the participants on this call. So the first poll is going to be about how each of the participants on this call's families are at dealing with accountability. So you should be getting a poll shortly that shows, is your family good at holding each other accountable? Okay, but we could be better. Or are we horrible at holding each other accountable? So, all right. We'll let it go one more time. All right. So what we have is 83% of participants in the poll say we do an okay job at holding each other accountable, but we could do better, and 17% say we do a horrible job at holding each other accountable. So interesting that we don't have anybody who feels like they're doing a really good job at accountability, which is probably why we are all on this webinar. All right, so let's do a second poll, and that is, how does our board do at holding management accountable? A board is a critical part of the accountability system in a family business. So when you have a chance, click on your answer to this, and we'll see how people feel about the board itself. See if our board does any better than our family does. All right, so in this case, we have some boards that are doing a decent job at holding management accountable. 17% say so, and 67% do an okay job, and 17% do a horrible job. So clearly some room for improving accountability here. So we'll move back into our presentation and talk about how do we hold management accountable. All right. So when we build accountability into our system, we're going to increase trust. Trust is critical to accountability. To create the environment where people want to be held accountable, you have to have a sense of trust, and that comes from communication. And when we communicate and we build trust, we build commitment, and that can create momentum. Often when we don't hold each other accountable, again, it creates a kind of cancer in the system. We want to guard against that. So our family needs to be accountable to each other. Shareholders connect with the board connects with management, and being clear about our roles in each of these systems is important. Knowing what the board is accountable for, knowing what shareholders are accountable, knowing for what family members are accountable is part of what gets confused in the family business conversation. So we need to be clear about the boundaries between these different roles and develop accountability in each of these systems. In actuality, there are a number of families that have created what they call accountability matrix. And what they do is they say, this is what the family is accountable for doing and communicating. This is what the shareholders are responsible for communicating and doing. This is what the board's responsible, so on and so forth. So what we're doing is we're getting clear about what we are accountable for and making sure that we're all on the same page. So in a family business system, when you're dealing with accountability that's broader than just one individual, you have to have governance to drive that accountability. So typically on the family side, what we're talking about is family meetings, a family council, a family assembly. In the business, we're talking about board of advisors or boards of directors. And sometimes from an ownership perspective, we're talking about shareholders meetings, or if we have assets outside the operating business, we'll have a family office that drives accountability for managing our assets outside the family business. So all of that's just to say that we need structure at times to drive accountability, but at the end of the day, it's largely about communication. So in a family governance model, we're accountable for really articulating the overarching goals, our values, our mission and vision. Why do we want to be in business together? I always say that when we start a business, we get to choose our business partners. When we inherit a business, every generation has to decide, why do we want to do this together? So the family governance system is accountable for keeping that family unified about where we're going and why we want to be in business together. And that includes the values, the mission, the vision, the family education, managing the family's relationship with the business, and boundaries between the family and the business, and employment policy is one of the ways that they do that, and create accountability for the family to the business system and vice versa. Ownership governance, the owners of the company need to decide, what businesses do we want to be in? What do we expect for our return on capital? What's the risk-reward ratio? How do we evaluate and elect the board? What kind of liquidity do we need? Buy-sell agreements, transition planning. These are all things that the ownership system really needs to be accountable for. And you can already start to see that there is some gray area between the family and the ownership group, in that there are some family members who may not be owners but may have a voice in some of these conversations. And finally, the business governance system, or our board, needs to hold management accountable and make sure that we're aligning the interests of the shareholders with what the management team is doing, and being a advocate for the interests and needs of all stakeholders, and of course review and approve the strategy. So one of the things that often comes up in the conversation is, what is the board's role in holding management accountable? Can we get a little bit more specific about that? So let's do that. So typically what a board will hold management accountable for are budgets, plans, timelines, data security, employee safety, human capital, looking at leadership development and succession planning, and aligning the vision and values of the shareholders with the strategy of the organization. So having a clear vision and strategy, values, culture, ethics, managing risk, engaging with shareholders, in addition to what we typically would associate with the board, which is the financials, the performance, making sure that there's integrity of reporting and internal controls. But at the end of the day, people have to want to be held accountable to the expectations that we set. So in order to create an environment where people want to be held accountable, this is really based on communication. Do we have a clear sense of mission and purpose that flows from the family to the board to the management team? Do we all feel part of the same system? And are we all rowing in the same direction, so to speak? The more we have a clear sense of mission, the more we have a higher sense of purpose that's about more than just the financial results, the more willing people will be to be held accountable. If people know their role and have a sense of how their role contributes to this mission, contributes to our vision for the future, our vision for success, we are more willing to be held accountable. So one of the ways you can think about this is does our team welcome accountability? When people are, we're going through the process of accountability, whether that be through personal reviews or after action planning after we go through a project, or whenever we're trying to hold people accountable, what are people's reactions to it? Do they welcome it? Do they share data openly, or do they protect themselves and try to manipulate data to avoid accountability? If there's more of the latter, then we may have some cultural challenges that we have to address. If people don't feel comfortable sharing information and opening themselves up to the viewpoints of others, then it's likely that our culture is somehow encouraging people to feel shame around accountability, rather than when accountability is working well, accountability is really something that people are proud of. They want to be held accountable, they want to have clear goals and objectives, and they want to contribute to this larger sense of mission. So if you think about that, think about where your family is on that spectrum. And if we're at that part of the spectrum where we're hiding information, we're not communicating, we're not sharing information openly, then we're probably in a situation where we need to do some heavy lifting and culture on the culture end of things, listening to people, understanding what people's experience of accountability is, and understanding a little bit about how we may make mistakes. So I'm going to roll into a little bit of a conversation around this is one model of accountability that people find helpful, just to start to break accountability down into different steps. And it all starts with communication and having a clear sense of mission and purpose. We want, at the highest level, the family to be setting the values, the sense of how we want to do business, and what our high-level goals are and objectives are, and then work our way down to the more specific issues at hand. So when we're talking about the board gets involved at high level of strategy, and then of course management is involved in execution. So we are going to go through this looking at accountability from the acronym SIMPLE. So it starts with setting expectations. In order to be accountable, we have to have clarity in expectations. We need to understand the expectations, how they tie to the bigger picture and our common goals, and make sure that everybody who's a part of the accountability process understands those expectations and their personal responsibilities in relation to that expectation. We need to invite commitment, and we'll go into more of these as we go through, measure progress, provide feedback, link to consequences, and then evaluate effectiveness. So we'll go through each of these in depth, but we'll start with setting expectations. So if you think about accountability in your families and your businesses, do we invite buy-in to the expectations? What's very common in first-generation family businesses is the leader of the business is the one who sets the expectations. They're dictated from on high. We use power and control to set expectations, and in most cases, that's not a good long-term strategy. For people to want to be held accountable, they need a certain level of buy-in to the expectations. What we've found in family businesses is that when we have a clear strategy, both from the family and from management, so we have a clear family strategy about what are our values, goals, and objectives with the business, with our assets, what's the impact that we want to have as a family, and the business has a clear strategy about where we want to go, it's easier to set expectations and tie them to the higher level goals of mission and vision and what we're trying to accomplish. So we should be talking about where are we now, where are we going, and how will we get there, and then drive to clear roles and responsibilities in achieving those goals and objectives. So some common mistakes that are made in this expectation setting process, number one is there's a disconnect with the family goals and expectations, is that our family governance system isn't talking to our business governance system, so the family meetings, family councils aren't communicating with the board's not communicating with management effectively, and we get a disconnect between the family goals and expectations and what the management team's actually doing. And do we have trust between these systems? Does the family trust the board? Does the board trust management? And does the family trust management? I have been involved with a number of families where because of certain family behaviors, there has developed a distrust between management and the family. So the management team starts to protect the business from the family, and that ultimately erodes the accountability process because they don't see the family as credible sources for accountability. They're not willing to be held accountable to family goals and objectives. So the family has to manage their own credibility, be prepared and knowledgeable, and live up to the values in order for management to be willing to be held accountable to them. Another mistake that gets made in family businesses is that we have a top-down approach. We set goals for people and expect them to be accountable to them. Now, there may be certain instances where that's necessary, but the more people feel invested in the creation of the expectations, the more they're willing to be held accountable to those goals. We set unrealistic goals. We often are optimistic in our family businesses, and we think we can do really amazing things, but so we set unrealistic goals, or the opposite of that, we sandbag it and set goals that are easily attainable, and that also can erode confidence and accountability, because we know that we're not challenging ourselves. We're not trying hard when we're sandbagging. If we have a culture where people set low goals, then we're not going to be building a sense of trust with each other. We want to have realistic goals that challenge us, but don't set goals that are low and easy to attain. Another common problem is we set too many goals. So when we have too many goals, it erodes accountability because people don't have a clear sense of priority in the goals, or they don't feel that they can accomplish any of them because they have so many goals, so that they tend to just say, I'm not even going to try because there's just too much to do here. I'm just going to do the minimum requirement. Goals aren't aligned with the strategy. We're not reinforcing the right things. We don't know how to measure our goals. I, I encounter in a lot of families where we set goals that sound great, but it's hard to measure what success looks like. I always like to use that question of, if we were successful in reaching this goal, what would it look like? How would we measure that? How would we know that we were successful in completing this goal? We don't set time frames, especially in family meetings. Sometimes we don't set time frames. We don't think more from that kind of structured approach. So when we don't have clear time frames, oftentimes it feels like our projects go on and on and on, and we're not getting anywhere because we don't have clear accountability to time frames. And another common mistake in family businesses is that we focus only on our financial goals. But often what protects the culture and builds the sense of culture in the organization is the goals that are non-financial. It is our values. It is how we take care of people. So at this point, I'll introduce another model of which can be used. Many of you may have heard this model before, but it's just another way to think about setting goals. We want our goals to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So SMART is the acronym here. This is the webinar of acronyms, so you'll get a few of them throughout the program. So we want our goals to be specific, that we all understand and have the same understanding of what the goal is. We want to know how to measure it. It has to be attainable and it has to be relevant to what we're trying to do, our strategy, so on and so forth, and be time-bound. So when we're setting our expectations, just making sure that we are attending to these issues will help make sure that we have good goals and good expectations. All right, so the next step in accountability is inviting commitment. We want to illustrate how the goals both benefit the organization, but also benefit the individuals and personally. So this is part of the conversation and part of being listened to. One of the most common challenges that I hear from families when I start working with them is, I don't feel heard, I don't feel valued. And in order for somebody to be willing to be held accountable, they have to feel that this impacts them personally, it will help them, and they understand their role in terms of the overarching high-level goals. And we want to help them understand how the goals move the organization forward. And again, this happens through a conversation. And so it can be one-on-one conversations. It can be, how do we communicate as a leadership team throughout the organization? How do we create dialogue so people can ask questions about the expectations? And enter a situation where everybody's got ownership over those commitments. It's very critical that people are committed to the expectations. Otherwise, we'll spend a lot of time spinning our wheels. We'll end up at the end of the day with goals or objectives that aren't met, and then being frustrated and angry at each other because we didn't achieve our goals and objectives. So let's talk a little bit more about commitment. Commitment is about the process. Is our goal setting, our expectation setting collaborative? Does it give us a sense of purpose? Do we review that process to continually improve it and create dialogue? Do we have a hierarchical structure where things are passed down from on high, or is it a collaborative culture? Now, the one caveat here is that in a crisis, we may need to be more directive and less collaborative in driving accountability, but especially when we're setting a long-term course or direction, we want to use our values as an organization to give people a sense of purpose, use our mission and our vision for where we want to go and what we want to do beyond just the financial success to drive that sense of purpose and connection to be accountable. The more we feel a part of something bigger than ourselves, the more we're creating that sense of unity. If we don't have commitment to our goals and objectives, we're again creating that kind of negative emotional backlash when people are being torn apart in some ways because they feel like people aren't being held accountable. I should also say that accountability can be a spectrum as well, or the emotions around accountability can be a spectrum as well. So the more accountability we have, the more unified we feel, and the other end of the spectrum is when we're not held accountable, that sense of unity gets torn apart. All right, next, measure progress. Do we quantify and track the necessary information to hold people accountable? One of the things that's difficult in many situations is quantifying what success looks like and tracking that information. Are we organized to get the information that we need to hold people accountable? And are we bringing the right people into the organization to accomplish that? So some ways that families do that is they develop dashboards. So what are the expectations that we set? And do we regularly look at our dashboard of the key financial indicators, the key non-financial goals and objectives, our expectations? Are we reporting on them regularly? Is our organization reporting on them regularly? You know, one mistake I've seen in a number of families is that we bury people in reports rather than picking out what are the really important goals or objectives, the really important expectations that we need to be monitoring. So one example of this was a board has set certain financial objectives, and instead of giving the kind of summary dashboard, the financial team has buried them in reports where they have to dig for that information. And that creates a sense of resentment. When we have clear expectations and clear ways to measure them, we can develop these dashboards for easy reporting where we can pull that information out very easily. Quarterly board reviews. Are we reviewing the reports? Are we developing a sense of transparency? Again, when we're creating a culture of accountability, what's happening is that we're creating the desire for people to share information and be held accountable. And measuring progress is one of the important things here. One of the dilemmas here that many families face is this often gets tied down to financial information, because measuring progress within the organization is often tied to compensation. So we want things that are clearly measurable. And so we tend to lean on just the financial variables because those are the most measurable, the easiest to identify as metrics. But we have to come back to that question of what would a successful completion of this goal look like, and how will we measure the progress towards that goal? So this might be an area for you to take some time and reflect on what are the challenges that we as a family face in measuring progress. What are the challenges that we face as a board, as a management team in measuring progress, and trying to get as specific as we can about those things. The more we have clear values, the more we have a clear mission, a clear vision for where we're going and what we're trying to do, again, a lot of these things start to fall into place. And the reality is that they take time. It takes work to identify these things, and it takes conversations. So if we have problems in communication in our organization, whether it be between family members, between family and management, we have a culture of anger and lashing out at each other, that communication process will make any of these steps harder. So at the core, we want fair process where the right people are involved, but also communication that is effective and supports getting clear about our expectations, that invites that sense of commitment, and that it enables us to agree on the measures of our progress. All right, so we've talked about setting expectations, inviting commitment, and measuring progress. How do we provide feedback? So when we're getting results and we're going through the process and we've got metrics, how do we solve problems and work on follow-up actions? So when we're talking about creating a culture of accountability, micromanagement and, again, top-down setting of expectations and telling people how to accomplish those goals and objectives in a micromanaging way does not build that sense of commitment to the larger goal. It does not build that sense of autonomy and creativity and innovation and in the people who are going to be accountable for executing these goals. So what I would ask you to think about is when we communicate about our goals, do we as an organization set the high-level goals and then give individuals within their area of responsibility and roles, do we give them the freedom, the autonomy to find the best way to execute and deliver on those goals? If we're driving a lot of top-down decision-making and giving people step-by-step solutions to achieve their goals and their accountability, we're robbing them of the growth ability for autonomy and ownership over their own execution, and in many ways that robs them of the desire to be held accountable. If you're just going to give me the steps, I don't have any ownership in that myself. So they often, when you give them that sense of autonomy, especially when you're dealing with complex problem solving, they're going to have more information to solve some of the problems of execution than the management team or the family will. So we want to give people the autonomy to understand the high-level goals and objectives and expectations, but then within the responsibilities of their role, execute those things in the way that they feel is appropriate. And feedback is part of that process that we need to drive forward on. So in providing feedback, we may need to have one-on-one meetings in checking in on accountability. So we've agreed on a set of expectations. We are both committed to them. We know how we're going to measure them. Let's check in on a regular basis. Let's be clear about when we're going to check in and how things are going. We may talk as a family group about what we're accountable for. One of the families that I work with puts their kind of goals and objectives on the wall, and they take the temperature of how we're doing in terms of achieving those goals each family meeting. So they give a rating. They actually have a temperature meeting, a 0 to 10, with 10 being we're being very accountable to our goals, and 0 we're a bit not being accountable. So they get an actual measure of how we're doing on these measures. So supervisor to workers, chairman at the board level would have regular meetings with the CEO. But at the end of the day, it's about creating an open environment for dialogue in the boardroom, in the family, and management. Are we creating this culture of conversation that's building trust and connection? So that family that I referenced where management doesn't trust the family, the boardroom dialogue is all about protecting the business from the family. So whenever something comes up that highlights that interface, the tension goes through the roof, and there's not a productive dialogue about where we're going and what we're trying to do. In an ideal situation, we feel trusting and we're willing to challenge each other. We know it's not a personal attack. It's about what's in the best interest of the organization as a whole. And the other thing about feedback is research shows that employees and family members want more feedback than they get. You know, one of the most common things I hear from next generation members in particular is I either get overly harsh feedback, no feedback at all, or sugar-coated feedback. I don't get accurate feedback. Some people sugar-coat the feedback because either they don't want to hurt my feelings or They think I'm going to be their boss someday, so they don't want to risk that. They don't give me any feedback at all, or sometimes parents give overly harsh feedback because they don't want to create the image that they're favoring their children and creating a sense of entitlement. So think about how we are as a family at providing feedback. One of the most common challenges we hear is I don't feel listened to, and I don't feel like I get any feedback about my performance. So think about that, and we'll give you a little model here, which will include another acronym. But understand that when we don't give feedback, individuals will often feel undervalued or overlooked. When we don't get feedback, we don't have accountability, we'll often get talented people leaving because they don't have the challenges that they need to grow and develop. We develop this cultural negativity of whispers, innuendo, trying to read signals, trying to read the system. And it tends to slow down the speed and quality of our business results. So if we create a feedback-rich culture, a culture of transparency where people know the expectations or bought into the expectations, this could really be a competitive advantage for our family and our business. Now, a quick note between the family and the business on this one is that the family side tends to be harder for people to deal with accountability for a couple of reasons. One is many of the family goals or expectations are not as easily measurable. They're not as quantifiable. So we may struggle with accountability on family governance issues, on family things, because of it being more difficult to measure these things. The other reason is that the emotions are higher often on the family side because there's more at stake in our relationships as family members. So think about that and think about what we can do to create a richer culture of feedback and trust, and so that we as a family can be more accountable to each other, because ultimately that will bring us closer together and create a greater sense of family unity. So here's your next acronym, which is one model of how to give feedback. So one is what happens when we're giving feedback oftentimes is that we're not specific about the observable action that happened. And this can be used for both positive feedback and negative feedback. But you did a great job. Okay, well, that doesn't really help me a whole lot. Or you really stunk at doing that. That type of feedback, while it gives me a little bit of a barometer about how I did, it doesn't really help me. So if we can be clear about what the action, whether it was positive or negative, is that we observed. So on Tuesday in the sales meeting, when you called me a jerk, that doesn't leave a whole lot of interpretation about what we're talking about. This is the action that happened. Then talking about the impact of that action or behavior. On Tuesday in the sales meeting, when you called me a jerk, I felt embarrassed. It made the rest of the team feel uncomfortable, and I think really derailed the meeting from achieving its main goal, which was to set our goals for 2018. So you're identifying the specific action, talking about its impact. In the future, if you're upset with me and you want to talk about something, if we could do this outside the room and not in the middle of the meeting, I more than welcome your feedback. If you feel like I'm a jerk and my actions aren't helpful, let's talk about that. So you're outlining the desired outcome in the future. So you're not trying to change the past, you're trying to talk forward and say, how could we do things differently in the future? This is, again, one model for giving feedback, but it helps to break down and move away from the overly emotional feedback that we often get, which is not specific. It's very general and highly charged in many ways, and tends to invite a reaction rather than really a conversation about how we connect with each other and our accountability to each other. All right, so we've talked about setting expectations, inviting commitment, measuring progress, providing feedback. Now, everybody's favorite piece, linking to consequences. Probably one of the more challenging things, especially in a family. We tend to, when we think consequences, think about bringing down the hammer. How do we punish people when they don't follow through with their goals and expectations? They don't achieve their goals and expectations. So if we can reinforce positive rewards and move away from creating a hammer, then we're going to have a more productive culture around accountability. The more consequences are seen as a negative, again, the more it's about the hammer and bringing down the hammer, we're going to stumble to create an environment where we have honest discussion. If I feel like I'm going to be shamed for not achieving my goals and objectives, I'm going to be called out, not just for not achieving the goals, but I'm going to be made to feel bad and shameful about not achieving those goals, then we're going to create more of a situation where people are likely to hide their actual results or manipulate the results so that they can protect their ego and their identity. If we reinforce more with positive rewards and don't focus on shaming when we do have to have negative consequences, we're going to have a stronger culture around these things. So, do we have positive reinforcement mechanisms towards meeting those expectations, the incentive things? Are we clear about what happens if goals aren't met? A lot of times, we get frustrated because we set the expectations, we do all the other steps, but we don't know what happens when the goals aren't met. And then the accountability system breaks down then. What are the impacts of the negative consequences that we have in place? And I would always direct you back to your values and the culture that you have as an organization. If we believe in a certain set of values, how will that inform the consequences that we put into place? If we look at our value statement, does that really support these very harsh consequences? If we have harsh consequences, and use your values to inform your consequences, and make sure that everybody understands the process. Who's driving the process? How are we managing that conversation? So on and so forth. So think about, how do we do it at having consequences, and are we clear about them and what the process looks like? So the last piece in this is evaluating our effectiveness, is that when we've set expectations and we've tried to achieve those expectations and we're done with the process, we've either been successful or unsuccessful, do we evaluate our effectiveness? Do we look at how we did in these different areas? Do we reflect on the process and think about what we could do better? So this, some families call this, do we do an after action review? So when we've had a particularly emotional accountability process, do we break it down and say what worked and what didn't? Do we try to understand what we did well and what we didn't do? So a few tips on this front: get input from those who participated in the process, look at the results, maybe doing that as a team together so that we all see that together, and also reporting back to those who maybe there's a smaller group that's gathering those results and evaluating those results. Communicating back to all who are involved in the process is important, so that they can understand the results and look at what we did well and what we didn't. And then getting clear about what are the actions we're going to take based on this feedback, based on what we heard. All of that will really help us drive accountability moving forward. So one last comment before I open up to questions is I just want to reinforce that all of these steps are important, but they're also all based on communication. So if we have basic problems in communication between family members, each of these steps is going to be harder. But sometimes having a model that we work through can make the conversation a little easier. But I want to emphasize that whenever you're improving communication, all of this process gets easier. So in all of your family meetings, you should be thinking about how are we improving communication and looking at the process of communication and when can we expect communication on certain issues. Predictability builds credibility, and credibility and predictability both help to build trust as well. So with that, I'll remind you again, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box. I'll take the first one that came in, and I think it's a pretty common one. This person is asking, what happens when someone refuses to be accountable or continually is not held accountable, or and this is a pattern that's developed over a long period of time? As I think about this question, you've got somebody who's resistant to accountability. I want to go back to a couple things. Number one, I want to start with what's that personal stance of this individual? What's going on in this person's life? Are there any mitigating factors like alcoholism or mental illness that might be preventing them from engaging in a productive way? Do they have self-esteem problems? Is this a larger family pattern where we've protected this individual for 20 years from accountability, and now we're starting to change the pattern, and that is getting a little dicey because we're trying to change a larger family pattern? So understanding the larger context is the first place to start. Is what's the reason that this person is resisting accountability? Because they obviously have something invested in this, and we as a family have something invested in this person being unaccountable, and that it gives us an opportunity to blame one person for a problem. The second piece I would say is set boundaries around what happens when they're not accountable. So we have expectations for what you're accountable in order to come to a family meeting. We have boundaries and clear expectations that are dealt with lovingly, not a hammer coming down to try to shame and blame somebody, which makes us feel powerful when we blame and shame other people. But if we can set boundaries, around love, I want to talk to you. I want to understand your needs, etc. But in order to do that, I need you to consistently show up to family meetings. I need you to do X, Y, and Z. But being clear about what I need and what my boundaries are, and not just letting them run roughshod and not have any boundaries between what they want and what I need, really hurts the situation. All right. Well, there are no other questions coming in. If you have any questions offline, you can feel free to email me at akeyt@fbn-na.org. That's akeyt@fbn-na.org. And if you want to register for the New York event, which will be September 28th and 29th, again, we have a great story from the New York Times family, the Peugeot family from France. You can email Jennifer Muntz at jmuntz, M-U-N-T-Z, @fbn-na.org. Thanks for participating in this webinar. We hope to see you all in New York, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.